All right, guys, Nate and I are here. We're going to go over what Jiu Jitsu is. This video could be good for maybe someone who's looking to get into Jiu Jitsu, someone who's a beginner just getting started, or a seasoned practitioner who just wants a better overall perspective of the martial art that they're practicing. Okay, so let's get started. So Jiu Jitsu, it's a grappling martial art focused on getting an opponent to the ground and immobilizing them to a position where you can apply a submission hold. Okay, usually that submission hold is around like a joint lock or some type of strangle, like a chokehold. Okay, so that's what Jiu-Jitsu is, the idea, okay, of how it developed. So majority of martial arts revolve around striking, right? And the idea behind Jiu-Jitsu is if we had to fight a bigger, faster, stronger opponent, the best chances for us to do that and do it safely would be to get close, close the distance, get the fight to the ground. Because once you get the fight to the ground, right, your opponent's ability to land forceful strikes already significantly goes down. And then especially if you can find a way to get to the top position, you can begin to start to pin your opponent, right, immobilizing them, and then using those positions to, if it was on the street, right, or in a fight, you could strike into a better position, or you can just continue to immobilize them to a point where you can apply these submissions, right? And it's just said, like, with distance, I always like to use the analogy, if you can think about boxers, right, whenever the action's getting real close and guys are kind of taking damage, what do? They always tie up, right? They tie up because instinctively, if we take up that space, right, it gives less room for the strikes to land. Now imagine that, but times 3 when you bring them down to the ground, you pin them on the ground, or vice versa, you're on your back, right? So it's just like we're kind of balancing and trying to find a way to get to a dominant position while the fight being on the ground to eliminate having forceful strikes be a significant part of the equation. Okay, so now that we understand kind of what Jiu-Jitsu is, there's usually 3 approaches or 3 patterns that you'll see Jiu-Jitsu being applied, whether that be in a match or in a fight. Okay, now these are just general patterns. You'll see these are the major 3s. We'll talk about some where like outliers will land. But the first way, right, is we start the fight standing. Okay, you take somebody down, you end up on top of them, you get past their legs, you mount their hips, okay? And then from there, you continue to progress your pin until you can establish some type of submission. So that would be the first way. Another way would be, okay, maybe I get taken down, I start on my back. So then it would be about establishing what we call a guard, which is any connection with your legs, using that connection to reverse from the bottom position to the top position, and then passing the legs and continuing to mount the hips, pin your way to submission. Now, the third way, okay, would be, okay, I get taken down, I establish a guard, I'm unable to sweep now. So now I'm stuck on my back, I'm being held down, right? So now, as the bottom person, you control the posture, whether that's keeping your opponent far away from you or bringing them super close and then establishing a type of submission. So examples of this for those of you that already practice, it's like a closed guard arm bar, right? Or it's like being in a single leg X position, right? And applying some type of leg entanglement or heel hook, right? These are all examples of being in a guard, controlling posture, and then submitting from your back, right? Now, these are the main 3 pathways you'll see Jiu-Jitsu take, okay? But now, of course, there's instances, right? For those of you that are practicing, you're like, oh, well, what about a guillotine or like some type of front choke? Right? And there are situations where anywhere in these phases you can catch a submission. But again, we like to look at, we call these things like as catches. Like you catch the submission. It's not necessarily controlling your way to submission, right? Now, what I would say about that is the difference is we're not going through a progression of pinning. A lot of times these are just literally going straight in for the submission. Now, I always use the analogy. There's nothing wrong with these things, but I always like to say, like, these are kind of like your Hail Marys or like those one-off shots, not very high percentage, right? The better you get at controlling someone and understanding the first 3, the higher percentage or the more likely it is that you'll be able to submit somebody or just be in a position to submit somebody. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to break down all three of these approaches, and then we'll kind of explain why it's important that you have that understanding of all three. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So we have takedown. Okay, take our opponent down, pass the legs, mount the hips, submit. So I'm going to be with Nate here. I'm going to just demonstrate. So we're going to be here, right? So a takedown can be anything where I get close on Nate. Okay, I get close to him, and let's just say I use a body lock takedown here. I'm going to knee bump, bring him to the floor. Okay, so now in this instance, okay, I've taken my partner to the ground. We've got that first step out of the way. Now let's imagine I'm going to get on top of him and his legs are in the way, right? This can be a big problem because now, like, if we take into consideration like a fight, right, the legs can be a deadly force. One, they're a good frame. They can keep me away from putting weight on him. But two, they can be forceful strikes from your opponent's back, such as like up kicks. Okay, so whether we take if we take our partner down and we already land past the legs, that's ideal, right? But if I don't, my second objective is to get past the legs here. Okay, now once I've passed the legs, I need to pin my opponent. Okay, now from here, I need to look to get to any position where my hips mount my partner's hips. Okay, now this can take the form of a mounted position, okay, or it can be rear mount, whether that be my partner belly down or me having my partner's hips in my lap here. Okay, so those would be all the forms of mounting the hips. So mount or rear mount, these are the main positions where you'll see submissions take place. Like in fights, you'll probably often see, right? Someone gets mounted, you see them throw punches, the partner inevitably turns to their stomach to avoid the damage, and then they sink in the strangle there, right? So that would be the most dominant progression. Take your opponent down, get past the legs, mount the hips, whether that's top mount or rear mount, and then you submit, okay? So this is the most dominant approach, okay? This is the most dominant approach because you maintain top position the whole time, okay? It's super important to understand this because, you know, a lot of times we learn all these techniques, but to understand where you want to go and what the ideal is important in streamlining all the techniques you learn throughout your jiu-jitsu journey, okay? So this is the most dominant, right? Statistically, when you look at fighting, self-defense, or sport jiu-jitsu, you'll see that this pathway is the most common, right? The only problem with this approach is it is the most physically demanding, right? Learning how to establish takedowns, learning how to be comfortable on your feet, getting to your feet, pinning, these are all physically demanding skills, right? But again, you got to pay the price for something that effective, most dominant approach. Okay, let's move on to the second one. So the second approach now is very similar to the first one. The only difference is maybe I'm the person that gets taken down. So let's just say I get taken down. Nate took me down. I'm on my back. So I start the fight on my back here. Okay, so now it's like the ideal would be I stand up and then take the first pathway, like stand up, find a way back to my feet, and then take Nate back down. Okay? But let's just say in a situation we're unable to stand up, or Nate's like putting weight on me here, okay? And I'm like, man, it's too late. I can't get up. Okay, so now in a situation like this, we might look to establish a guard, right? A guard would be any connection, okay, with my legs to my opponent. So this would be an example of a closed guard, probably the strongest guard. We'll scoot back just a little bit here. Okay, so this would be like a closed guard, right? So step one, establish a guard. Okay, this is happening because I can't get to my feet. I can't take my opponent down. So now once I've established a guard, my main objective is to look to get back to the top position. Again, remember, being on top is going to be the number one priority because it's the highest percentage position, right? So here, let's just say I reverse okay, my opponent. Now, if we landed in front of the legs, we'd have to pass the legs. But in this instance, I'm already mounted on the hips, right? Again, top position, super dominant one, because I have all the options I control, right? I can leave if I have to leave. I can stay connected if I have to stay here, right? I can strike if I want to strike. Nate, on the other hand, he's pinned against the ground and he's fighting against my weight and gravity. So everything is hindered for my opponent on bottom. Okay, now from here, same thing. We keep up with the same progression. Establish the pin, go for a submission. Again, could be a choke, could be a joint lock, okay, such as an arm lock here. Any variations of those two. Okay, so second one, again, I would say it's the second dominant only for the reason that you're starting the fight on your back. So it's not complete dominance, right? And if you're able to get to your feet, that would be the most ideal. For example, if you watch MMA, right? No one really wants to take that chance of being on your back because it's still a small moment where your opponent could potentially strike you, even if you do have a guard, right? Now, this approach you'll probably see more commonly in sport jiu-jitsu, right? You'll see guys pull guard, right? And the reason being is because oftentimes it's more efficient or less physically demanding to learn how to sweep versus stand up, right? Standing, you got to build that strength of holding a strong stance, learn how to off balance your opponent, learn a variety of throws and wrestling takedowns, okay? But sweeping, you can kind of work off of your back. So you'll see a lot of people in jiu-jitsu, like they just take that approach of just fighting off their back as the number one approach, okay? But when you compare the two, okay, takedowns are going to be the most dominant, but you still want that skill of being able to sweep off your back just in case you can't stand with someone. Or if you are significantly smaller, you can probably anticipate being on bottom in the beginning of the fight. So being able to reverse the position, which we call sweeping, and end up on top and then carry out that control process is going to be very beneficial. Okay? So now let's talk about, that leads us to the third common situation. And that's going to be us once again starting on our back. Maybe we got taken down, or if this is a sport instance, we're pulling guard, right? And now we can't stand up, nor can we sweep, right? So now we're like down, we're running out of options. Our opponent's really good at pinning us. We can't get up, can't take them down, we can't sweep. So now we're only left with one other option, and which is to submit off of our back. Okay? So same thing, we have to establish some type of guard. For this example, I'll show close guard. Can you skip back for a bit, Nate? So close guard here. Now controlling posture, I know that's a vague term, but it can be one of two things. In a close guard instance, I want to be tight, right? Chest to chest, right? I want to be close. So one, if this is a fight, it's hard for Nate to strike me, right? And two, if his posture is low, this gives me more space to apply submissions such as a triangle choke, okay, or an arm bar, right? But also controlling posture can mean keeping distance. So I'll give you guys the example of a single leg X guard. So closed guard was where I'm wrapping the whole body. This is another way we can use our legs to control our opponent. Now my leg is a type of frame here. Okay, now I can use this, right, to keep Nate at bay. Okay, and then from here, I can use these to get into certain leg entanglements where I can start attacking heel hooks or foot locks and submit from there. Okay, now once again, this is the third example. This is establishing a guard, controlling the posture, and then submitting. Okay, now this is I always like to say, like, this is your last resort, right? I can't get on top of my opponent, right? So I resort to this. Now, this is probably something you see a lot of people focus on in the beginning. Like I said, like when you're first starting jiu-jitsu, everyone gets fascinated with the submissions and everyone likes to learn guard because takedowns are hard. A lot of people don't like doing them because they're physically demanding. So a lot of times you see people spend a lot of their jiu-jitsu time just laying on their back, learning how to play guard, most of the time hunting submissions or sweeping, right? But it's actually the least dominant pathway to victory going that route, right? And again, if you're someone that's in this for self-defense or fighting, that's the one resort, that's the one area you don't want to take the fight. You don't want to start the fight on your back, and you want to try to get to your feet as quick as you can. But if you can't, it's just slowly going in the top person's favor, right? The direction of the fight, and putting you more and more at risk. Even these positions where I could submit, close guard, single leg X, there's still a big opportunity for the person on top to potentially break through those frames and land lethal strikes. So again, it's a great option. You must have that ability to control posture and submit from your guard. But again, it's important to understand when you compare with the two other approaches that it's the least dominant one, right? So with that being said, like why is it important to understand all of this, right? So it's important to understand all of these progressions of jiu-jitsu, because whether you're an athlete or whether you're just an enthusiast, right, you want to build the most well-rounded game that you can build, right? And it's important to understand whatever you're learning in class, you have to know, how am I actually going to apply this? And what approach do these techniques favor? Okay. This just adds a little more direction to the knowledge that you're already getting, so that you can, one, understand when and where to apply the techniques, but two, you can also fill in the gaps. So if you're like, man, I learned a lot of guard stuff, but I actually don't even know how to get someone to the ground from the feet, then it's like, oh, that means option A, the most dominant pathway to victory, my skill set does not favor that. So I should either continue to learn and try to develop that side, or just at least have the awareness of like, yo, that's a big hole in my game. Something should be done. Again, it's your choice, your game, what you want to do with it. A lot of people, they're like, hey, I'm a guard player, I'm happy, I just want to be a guard player. Again, not what I would promote amongst my students. I would say be as well-rounded as possible, but it's important to have that perspective and to know that these are areas in my game where I'm weak, so that if I don't want to get better at them, at least, right, I can understand how to deal with them and bring it back to the approach that I like. So if I'm a guard player, I'm like, yo, I just like to sweep or submit from my back, I'm never going to do takedowns. Again, I wouldn't recommend that, but at least you can understand, you should understand takedowns so that you can find a way to get the fight to where you want it to be, okay? Now, in another video, we'll kind of break down what skills each of these progressions take, and maybe how we might structure our training in a way to develop these skills. I'll even break down kind of how we like to do things at Kata, give you guys some insight in how we use our classes for skill development, and then how we recommend our students approach their training. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for more. Our next video, like I said, we're going to go over more in depth. We're going to start posting a little bit more on training tips, as well as other techniques and stuff that's going on at our neighborhood dojo here at Kata. All right, thank you guys.